Picture this. I'm standing in a tiny hut on the edge of a frozen valley. The wind scratches at the walls like a desperate animal, and the fire at my feet gasps for breath. A woman, her face carved by years of cold, presses a glowing stone to her baby's chest so it won't turn blue before sunrise. I can see the steam rise from her trembling hands. Now picture another world. Far to the south, a queen walks barefoot across marble floors that still remember the desert heat. Gold light spills through her palace windows. She hums to herself as if the sun obeys her voice. Two worlds, one ruled by frost, the other by fire. And yet, their survival depends on the same secret. Tonight, I'll take you with me, from the ashes of northern villages to the golden dust of forgotten kingdoms, to uncover the secret world of queens and servants. Good evening, traveler. I'm glad you're here. Before we go anywhere at all, let's slow down together. Dim the lights, or let the room be exactly as it is. Both are permissions I give myself when I tell these stories. If you're in a small apartment, a dorm, a late train cabin where the intercom crackles, or a distant city where rain taps the window like a polite guest. Wherever you are, take one easy breath with me. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Nothing fancy, just air, your first and oldest inheritance. I imagine you settling in. Maybe a lamp glows in the corner, throwing a thin gold halo over a stack of unread books. Maybe your kitchen hums softly, the refrigerator a domesticated thundercloud, the kettle a little volcano that shows civility. If you're walking, let the rhythm of your steps meet the rhythm of these words. If you're lying down, let the mattress remember the shape of your day and then forgive it. I'm not in a palace tonight. I'm by an imaginary hearth that belongs to all of us, the kind that makes old timber smell like bread. In the mind's eye there's a low fire, and the old iron sings a note no one taught it. The air is a handbook of smoke and earth, the kind that used to settle into people's hair and follow them to bed. Close your eyes if it's safe to do so. Hear the pop of resin. Hear the wind snarl once, then think better of it. I always begin with warmth because warmth is permission. In the northlands of our story it meant life, and in the southlands it meant order, bread rising, ink drying, guards dozing in courtyards because the stone kept no grudges after sunset. Tonight, I'll hold the door between those climates and ask you to step through. No passport, no coin, just curiosity. If you wish, tell me where you're listening from. I like hearing the roll call of places. Lisbon, midnight. Jakarta, dawn. Winnipeg, -20 and counting. It's oddly comforting to map these coordinates and imagine tiny flares of lamplight answering each other across the dark. History feels less lonely when I remember the present is full of witnesses. There's a hush in this hour that I trust. The day's errands have collapsed into a neat pile of receipts, and whatever didn't get done has accepted, begrudgingly, that it belongs to tomorrow. Our minds walk more gently at night. We forgive ourselves for not being kings of our calendars. We accept the scandalous possibility that listening, simply listening, might be enough work for one evening. Set the stage with me. Wood walls that learned to bend rather than break. A floor scattered with straw. A pot hung on a blackened hook like a moon that got practical. There's a stool near the fire and it knows your weight already. Sit, warm your hands. The past will take longer if you go at it cold. I talk softly because the people in this story did. In winter, quiet wasn't politeness, it was survival. Sound carried, and snow liked to make announcements. If you whispered, the frost couldn't find you. If you listened, you could hear the roof deciding how much snow it could hold. Silence, in places like Valmir, wasn't emptiness. It was a technique. I talk softly, too, because palaces have ears even when they sleep. Marble pretends indifference, but it remembers footsteps, betrayals, fanfare. It remembers the way bare heels sound different from armored ones. I picture the southern queen we will meet later, toes cooled by stone that still keeps the noon inside it. I picture the way her breath fogs a window briefly, proof that even in heat, bodies carry winter. For now, be here with me. Inhale through the nose. Imagine carrying the breath down to where your ribs meet like two hands in a pact. Exhale, slow, as if you were nursing a coal, not wanting it to flare, just wanting it to stay. That simple practice kept huts alive. That same patience kept courtyards calm. I carry a small superstition when I tell history. That the past is more generous if I arrive as a guest, not a thief. So I knock. I announce myself. I promise to put everything back where I found it, even the uncomfortable truths. Especially those. You'll hear me avoid easy villains. We'll ask instead, who benefited, who suffered, who decided? We'll notice incentives like other people notice constellations. We'll measure power not by crowns but by the way bread moves through a city. If you brought worries in with you, set them near the hearth for a while. Worries love hot places. They loosen and uncoil like old rope. You can collect them on your way out if you want them back, but it's fine to forget one or two here. The night can store a few without complaint. I'm thinking of Valmir, where our path begins. Not a kingdom on any map you've used, but familiar in the hands. Rough wood, mended wool. A door that swells when it snows. The north is honest, it tells you what it wants. Feed the fire, patch the roof. Share heat, hoard it, and children cough. Spend it, and the village remembers your name when the river cracks. That kind of arithmetic writes law better than judges. I'm thinking of Sethem, too, a name that tastes like sand when you say it. There the sun is not enemy but supervisor. Markets open early to flatter it. Walls keep it in check like a proud animal. Water is a letter of credit you sign with patience. In such places, shade is not a luxury, it is infrastructure. Songs lengthen at noon because words are slower under heat. Between those edges, ice and sun, there's in a room you know well. The screen dims a little and your reflection floats in it, an unintended ghost. Maybe you've paused a dozen times already to tend to something small. A message, the kettle, a cat that decided your keyboard is the warmest country. That's fine. History can take a hint. It will wait, politely, hand folded over hand. Before we step farther, let me set an intention the way some people set a table. I will be careful. I will be tender with the dead. I will not embroider where the fabric is strong enough. If a detail is legend, I will say so. If a record wavers, I will let it waver. Where the archive is silent, I will not shout over it. I will, however, stand very close to that silence and describe its shape. And I will notice the servants. Always the servants. Their footsteps are the metronome of every palace, their breath the uncredited chorus. Queens learn quickly that power without service is theatrical but brittle. Servants learn that service without power is holy but dangerous. Between them, in the exchange, something like civilization survives a winter. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, listen to the last thing the room wants to tell us before we begin. The hearth hums like a distant drum. The window holds the outline of a tree that doesn't know we're watching. Somewhere a neighbor closes a cupboard, and the sound wanders through pipes until it becomes a memory of rain. The whole building breathes. You do too. That's the only contract we need. Welcome to the quiet hour. We'll keep it. We'll carry it. And when dawn decides it's time to collect us back into errands and headlines, we'll leave a small ember of it glowing on the grate, so there's a place to return to the next night. Warmth travels well when shared, and it does not ask who it warms. Before kings learned to carve their names into marble, people like me lived by simpler inscriptions, scratches on wood, soot on the wall above a hearth, the pattern of footprints that told who had passed before dawn. In Valmir, we didn't write history, we inhaled it with the smoke. Every wall in the village carried a faint memory of fire, every roof beam a record of storms survived. When I close my eyes, I still hear the rhythm of that world, the slow percussion of work and weather, the hum of breath against frost. Our houses were patient things, stitched together from timber and faith. Smoke curled through thatched roofs in lazy gray ropes that never hurried, even when the wind threatened to scatter them. The air inside smelled of pine resin, wool grease, and boiling broth. You could tell the time of day by the pitch of the chimney. Low smoke meant morning, blue smoke meant evening, and no smoke at all meant grief. Children played between steaming cauldrons, chasing one another with wooden spoons. Their laughter mixed with the clatter of iron pots and the dull thud of logs being stacked outside. Mothers patched clothes in the same rhythm their daughters would one day inherit: needle in, breath out, stitch, sigh. Fathers split wood, eyes measuring each swing like a prayer. We did not think of ourselves as poor. Poverty is a comparison, and comparison is a luxury. We simply were tired, warm, and alive enough to keep the rhythm going. Our gods were pragmatic. The villagers of Valmir believed in Elandra, goddess of warmth, because warmth could be measured. You either had it or you didn't. You could feel her favor in the coals that refused to die at midnight, in the breath that fogged a window and did not freeze. We left offerings not of gold or incense but of small, useful things. A splinter of dry wood, a scrap of wool, a child's first tooth wrapped in linen. In return, Elandra gave us predictable winters and the promise that mercy, like fire, could be coaxed from nothing. The world beyond our valley was rumor. Traders passed through twice a year, bringing salt, stories, and the strange luxury of doubt. They told us of cities built from stone so smooth that snow slid off them like spilled milk, of southern lands where rivers never froze and people complained of heat the way we complained of cold. We listened politely, stirred our pots, and decided those places probably smelled wrong. To us, comfort was suspect. It softened the mind. Even hardship had etiquette. If a neighbor's fire went out, you shared your own. If someone's child coughed through the night, the village healer, Myra's mother, left a warm stone wrapped in cloth by their door before sunrise. We believed warmth was not property but pulse, a current that had to move to stay alive. It traveled from house to house the way breath travels through a choir, one note sustained by many throats. Our seasons were a kind of governance. The river was the calendar, its moods dictated ours. In spring, the ice cracked open like a promise, and everyone exhaled together. Summer was brief and hard-working. We dried fish, cured meat, harvested herbs that could trick pain into silence. Autumn was anxious, the weeks of bargaining between hunger and hope. And winter was the long meeting we all attended without invitation. The frost came like a tax collector, precise and indifferent. But even it had rules. It arrived when the moon was right, stayed its appointed months, and left without theatrics. There was order in that predictability. When the first flurries came, we did not panic, we prepared. Fires were banked carefully each night, buried in ash to sleep until morning. Children learned the art of coaxing flame before they could read. We mended tools, recited old tales, and reminded each other that every storm ends with thaw. That certainty was our wealth. And perhaps that's why we never saw change coming. Certainty dulls the senses. It trains the heart to mistake routine for safety. Looking back, I can see how fragile our balance truly was. Beneath our rituals of warmth lay an assumption as dangerous as any sword. That nature would always keep its promises. When I walk the ruins of Valmir now, yes, there are ruins, though I'll get to that later, I can still trace the floor plan of our lives. The hearth sat in the center, the axis of everything. Around it we built not just walls but customs. A visitor was greeted with bread before words. Fire was tended before prayer. We taught children that to let a flame die unattended was a kind of betrayal. They learned early that warmth demanded vigilance. I used to think those habits were quaint superstitions. But as I grew older, I began to sense the intelligence behind them. The elders were not ignorant, they were engineers of survival. They understood that community functioned like a fire. If you hoarded heat, it died. If you shared it, it multiplied. We didn't have equations for it, but we lived the physics. We also lived with boundaries so natural we never questioned them. The forest, for example, was both provider and judge. We took only fallen wood unless the frost was desperate. Rivers were crossed only in daylight. The sky told time, the wind announced guests. Every element had a voice, and we were fluent enough to listen. When I recall those days, I don't romanticize them. We were not noble peasants living in harmony with nature. We were practical animals negotiating rent with the weather. Still, there was dignity in our small victories, the way we turned endurance into art, scarcity into structure. We sang while we worked because silence invited fear. We named storms after children to remind ourselves that destruction and birth shared the same vocabulary. That was the world before the rule changed. Before the frost arrived early and refused to leave. Before smoke stopped climbing and began to sink. In the records that survived, charred scraps of bark, fragments of song, it's hard to tell exactly when the balance tipped. One moment the rhythm held, the next it stumbled. Perhaps that is how collapse always begins. Quietly, in the comfortable heartbeat between chores. If I could speak to my younger self, the boy stacking logs, the one who thought Elandra's mercy was guaranteed, I'd tell him that stability is just a pause between surprises. I'd tell him that warmth is not a right but a loan, and every generation must renegotiate its terms. But of course, he wouldn't listen. None of us did. We were too busy feeding the fire, believing that as long as it burned, the world would behave. We mistook habit for covenant and faith for insulation. We didn't know that the frost had already started walking south, slow and patient as truth. When the first signs came, the river glazing over an early harvest, the birds leaving without ceremony, we called it unusual, not impossible. Farmers prayed louder. Children played quieter. The sky turned the color of pewter, and still we said, it will pass. It always had. That was Valmir before the forgetting, before the stranger, before the ashkeepers learned that faith and physics were the same thing written in different tongues. A world stitched together by rhythm, unaware that the needle was about to break. And me? I remember the warmth most of all, not its comfort but its discipline. How it asked for attention. How it punished neglect. How it taught us, without words, that survival was not a miracle but a habit. That was our beginning. Smoke, rhythm, certainty. The hum before the silence. The breath before the wind forgot its manners. The world before the rule change. That winter came too soon. Not the poetic kind of too soon, not the sentimental sigh of a farmer who wishes for one more harvest day. No, this was mathematical. The first frost carved its initials into the fields a full month early, and the river, our clock, our confidant, froze before it had finished whispering summer's secrets to the sea. I remember the sound of it, that sharp, crystalline groan as the water surrendered. It was the sound of rules breaking. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Every village has its optimists, and in Valmir they wore the faces of people who'd survived worse. The cold is only bluffing, they said. A short tantrum. They stacked firewood with confidence, patched roofs, counted grain. But optimism is a kind of debt, and the interest comes due fast. Within weeks, the fields that should have been golden were hard as stone. Potatoes split open like secrets. The fish traps froze mid-river, their ropes brittle as bones. Smoke thickened above the village for a while, a stubborn protest. But then even that began to thin. Fires struggled for breath. The air itself felt heavier, like the sky had fallen a few inches lower. When wood burned, it whispered instead of roared. Sparks that once leapt eagerly from the hearth now clung to the logs, reluctant to live. And the smell, half ash, half fear, settled into everything. You couldn't wash it out of your hair or your thoughts. People adjusted, as people always do at first. They moved closer to the fire, then closer still, until family boundaries blurred and the hut became a single organism of shivering limbs. We learned new geometries of survival. Adults on the outside, children in the middle, blankets as treaties, shared breath as currency. Every night we listened to the wind's arithmetic, counting cracks in the roof, measuring how long until dawn by the number of times the flames hiccuped. The livestock died first. The frost crept into their lungs while they slept. We found them stiff at dawn, eyes glazed, mouths dusted with ice like sugar gone wrong. The elders said Elandra was testing us, and we nodded because disbelief required too much energy. We turned their bodies into fuel, though none of us said it aloud. Fire is fire. The gods never asked for itemized offerings. And then came the quiet. Not peace, peace has texture. This was absence, the kind of silence that seems to absorb your thoughts as soon as you think them. Even the forest stopped moving. Branches held their breath. Birds, if they remained, did not sing. The whole world seemed to be listening for something, perhaps waiting for permission to continue. I remember one night in particular. The sky was clear enough to see stars trembling in their cold. I stood outside, my boots fused to the ground by frost, and looked at the horizon. There was light there, a faint shimmer, bluish, like the ghost of a sunrise that had lost its way. It pulsed once, twice, and vanished. The air cracked audibly, as if reality itself were adjusting a joint. When I went back inside, the fire was out. We tried to relight it, but the logs refused. Even the dry ones hissed and died, as though the frost had rewritten the physics of flame. That's when despair arrived, not as drama, but as detail. The way my mother's hands trembled when she reached for tinder. The way my father exhaled through his nose, measuring his fear in invisible plumes. When hope fails, it does so quietly. That was the night we first called on Elandra in earnest. Not the casual gratitude of daily prayers, but pleading, the desperate kind that forgets its manners. My mother placed our last ember in a bowl, wrapped it in cloth, and pressed it to her chest like a child. We took turns breathing on it, whispering the old chant, in through the nose, out through the heart. The ember glowed faintly, then dimmed, then glowed again. It was alive, but barely. Like us. By dawn, the frost on the window had grown thicker than glass. Shapes moved within it, swirls that looked almost intentional, like handwriting from another world. And then, without warning, a figure appeared outside the door. Cloaked, silent, taller than anyone I'd ever seen. His eyes glowed like the last coals in a dying fire, and when he raised his hand, the frost on the door melted in a single breath. We didn't speak. Words felt too fragile. He stepped inside, carrying something in his palm, a handful of dust that shimmered blue in the firelight, though there was no fire. He scattered it over the dead hearth. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the room filled with a sound I still can't name, a low hum, part wind, part music, part relief. Flames rose, bright and impossible, and the cold retreated like a defeated army. We gasped, stumbled backward, covered our faces. The heat was too sudden, too clean. It smelled not of wood but of metal and rain. My father reached for the stranger, maybe to thank him, maybe to make sure he was real, but the man stepped away. His eyes dimmed to ember, then to shadow. He said nothing, no warning, no price. He simply turned, left the hut, and disappeared into the white. We followed his footprints until they stopped existing, halfway across the frozen field. There, the snow was melted into a perfect circle, the ground black and warm beneath it. The frost never returned to that patch, not even in the deepest winters that followed. We called it Elandra's mark. After that night, something changed in the air. Fires lit more easily. Smoke rose straight and tall, as if saluting some invisible order. The village came back to life, cautiously at first, then with the reckless relief of people who've been spared without explanation. We told the story 100 ways. That he was an angel, a ghost, a traveler from the god's own hearth. My mother claimed she'd seen his breath frost and symbols, that his shadow moved differently from his body. Skeptics, there are always a few, suggested he'd carried some alchemical powder, a mineral from the mountains that burned hotter than wood. They said it was science, not miracle. But in Valmir, we didn't distinguish between the two. If it saved you, it was sacred. The following nights, every family began burying embers in ash, afraid that the stranger's gift might be temporary. We called it, keeping the breath. Each morning, we'd dig them up, whisper thanks, and share whatever heat we had left with neighbors whose fires had faltered. It became ritual before it became necessity, and necessity before it became law. Yet even as warmth returned, unease lingered. The frost had taught us that certainty could fracture. Children asked where the stranger had gone. Elders debated whether to send scouts after him, but who would volunteer to chase a miracle? You can't track something that walks between elements. That winter ended, eventually. The snow thinned, rivers sighed back to life, and green began to argue with white at the edges of the fields. But we knew, somewhere deep, beneath gratitude, that the rules had shifted. Fire no longer felt purely ours. It had been given back, not earned. Years later, when historians wrote about the first renewal of Valmir, they treated the event like myth, a fable about human perseverance. But I was there. I remember the stranger's eyes, the way the light bent around him, the way the fire's color changed slightly, blue at the core, as if remembering the dust that birthed it. I remember how my hands stopped shaking only when I realized I could see my breath again. And I remember the silence after he left, that enormous quiet that wasn't emptiness but expectation. As if the world itself were waiting to see what we would do with the gift we'd been given. We didn't know it yet, but the stranger hadn't saved us. He had recruited us. The frost was only the beginning. After the stranger's visit, warmth returned, but never in quite the same way. Fire no longer felt obedient. It felt conditional, as if waiting for proof of worth. People began tending it with reverence bordering on superstition. They buried embers at night, sealed in small clay jars, and dug them out at dawn like relics. Some said the ritual was gratitude, others whispered it was insurance. Either way, the rhythm spread faster than rumor. Within a year, every hearth in Valmir glowed from the same lineage of flame, descended from that single night of blue dust. We called ourselves Ashkeepers. At first, the name was humble, nothing more than a description of the task. Families took turns carrying warm stones to neighbors whose fires had died. Each household maintained a ledger of who had shared heat and when, though not in writing, memory was enough. We valued generosity as currency. A family known for stinginess could expect thin soup at harvest feasts, while those who shared freely found themselves mysteriously favored when storms tore roofs or crops failed. Warmth built reputation. Reputation built survival. But as seasons turned, ritual hardened into system. We began crafting special jars, ceramic at first, then iron-lined, designed to keep embers alive longer. Children apprenticed in the art of breath control, learning how to exhale across the coals without extinguishing them. In through the nose, out through the heart, the elders recited, tapping their chests to mark the rhythm. The phrase became both instruction and creed. It meant, tend what sustains you, but don't smother it. I was a boy then, maybe 12, and I remember how serious it felt to hold a living ember in my palms. The heat licking the lines of my skin like a secret learning my name. To drop it was unthinkable. To hoard it was worse. We were taught that fire, like trust, died of loneliness. Myra's mother, Elandra's midwife, some called her, formalized the customs into what she named the breath law. Each night before sleep, the oldest or youngest member of the household buried the day's ember in a bowl of ash, whispering, "Rest, but do not forget." Each morning it was revived and shared among the neighbors in a small ceremony that looked almost like communion. The law spread faster than any decree from kings or priests ever could, because it was enforced by need, not fear. The breath law transformed Valmir's economy. We began trading warmth itself. A heated stone wrapped in wool could buy bread, mend quarrels, seal promises. When strangers passed through, they paid for shelter not with coin but with heat. The village discovered that its cold was a market and its compassion a resource. We didn't call it capitalism, but we practiced an early form of it all the same. As our methods improved, the Ashkeepers gained status. They were chosen not for strength but for steadiness, those who could balance reverence with practicality. They developed rules. Never carry embers during a storm. Never exchange warmth without acknowledgement. Never sleep beside a dying fire without speaking to it first. Outsiders found these habits absurd, but they kept us alive. When traders returned the next year, they noticed our fires burned hotter, longer, steadier. They carried news of this miracle to other valleys, and soon travelers began arriving not for salt or wool but for knowledge. The first to come were scholars from the southern cities, curious about our primitive thermodynamics, though none of us knew that phrase then. They brought strange tools, mirrors that captured sunlight, powders that changed color with heat. We watched politely as they tested and scribbled. Some of them stayed through winter, fascinated by our rituals. They tried to explain our success through science. They spoke of airflow, insulation, chemical balance. We listened, nodded, and continued our chants. For us, meaning mattered more than mechanism. When they left, they carried not just notes but small jars of ash, souvenirs of what they called the Valmir phenomenon. One day, I'd read about it in Southern archives, reinterpreted as discovery, stripped of its prayers. But in the moment, we didn't mind. We had warmth, and that was enough. As the system matured, it began to shape even our architecture. Houses were built closer together, walls sharing heat like neighbors sharing gossip. Central hearths replaced private ones. Streets narrowed, trapping warmth between them. You could walk from one end of Valmir to the other without losing the scent of smoke or the echo of someone's lullaby. The entire village became one breathing organism. Yet every system, no matter how sacred, invites hierarchy. The ashkeepers' influence grew. They became arbiters of distribution, deciding who received warmth during shortages. What began as service slipped toward governance. Their gatherings turned solemn. Their voices carried the weight of law. Mira, young then but already formidable, challenged them. "Fire doesn't need priests," she said once, loudly enough for the elders to hear. "It needs stewards." They ignored her, but I remember how their eyes tightened, as if her words had drawn blood. The ashkeepers introduced new ceremonies to legitimize their power. During the night of renewal, every household extinguished its fire simultaneously. Only the keeper's central flame remained, burning in the square. At dawn, they divided it among the villagers, each family receiving a spark wrapped in blessed cloth. It was beautiful, terrifying, and effective. From that night forward, fire belonged not to individuals but to the collective. To refuse participation was to risk exile, which in winter meant death. Still, there was unity in the ritual and awe. I remember standing in that square as dawn bled into the sky, watching thousands of tiny lights bloom in sequence. For a brief moment, Valmir looked like the heavens inverted, a constellation of hearths, each star a promise. The scholars who later chronicled us used words like innovation and communal engineering. They missed the essence entirely. What we built wasn't technology, it was faith operationalized. The breath law was our algorithm, our social code. It measured virtue in warmth shared, sin in warmth withheld. It turned morality into physics. There were rumors, of course. Some said the blue dust that revived our fires still lingered in the ash, that it had changed the nature of flame itself. Others believed the stranger had not been human at all but an emissary testing our capacity for stewardship. A few skeptics argued he'd simply brought knowledge we didn't yet understand, phosphorus, perhaps, or some mineral that stored heat. The debates filled long nights, but no one doubted the results. Our fires thrived. What fascinates me now, looking back, is how quickly we learned to bureaucratize wonder. We cataloged miracles, issued permits for their maintenance, built hierarchies to oversee their purity. Faith turned into administration. Every ember was logged, every jar stamped with the ashkeeper's seal. And yet, beneath the regulation, the old tenderness persisted. Mothers still whispered to their fires before sleeping. Children still traced hearts in the soot. Eventually, traders carried fragments of our rituals south. They replaced our chants with formulas, our breath pattern with bellows. But even in translation, something of the spirit survived. In the desert empire of Sethem, Priests would later discover that controlled breath could temper metal and calm the pulse of the sick. They claimed it as their own revelation. They never knew it began in a frozen hut, with a frightened family and a handful of blue dust. The breath law endured for generations. It taught us to see warmth not as luxury but as language, a way of saying, I see you, I share your survival. It was both religion and regulation, myth and mechanism. We had no written scripture, only the steady conversation between fire and breath. Historians would later call it the first sustainable energy system of the North. I still call it what it was: gratitude made procedural. And like all gratitude, it carried within it the seed of dependence, a quiet reminder that gifts, if misunderstood, can become chains. Her name was Mira, and she was the first person I ever saw command fire with a whisper. Even as a child, she carried herself with the composure of someone who had negotiated with the elements and won. She was the daughter of Thalen the healer and student of the breath law's oldest traditions. The villagers said she could read the wind and know when the frost would return, that her hands were so steady she could balance an ember on her palm without burning. I was younger by 2 winters, still apprenticed to my father in the timber fields. Mira fascinated me. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the clean, practical way of those who spent their lives outdoors, but because she made everything else seem clumsy. When others coaxed flames with flint and curses, she used patience. She'd cup her hands around the spark, breathing gently until it bloomed like a shy animal deciding to live. In through the nose, she'd remind us, smiling, out through the heart. The villagers trusted her more than the council of ashkeepers. When a child's fever burned too high or an elder's hearth went out, Mira was the one they called. She never refused, no matter the hour or weather. I once followed her through a blizzard to a hut where an infant had stopped crying from cold. She heated a stone in her own oven, wrapped it in cloth, and pressed it to the baby's chest until the tiny lungs remembered how to breathe. That child lived. People still whisper her name at birthings, though centuries have thinned the syllables. Mira grew into legend without meaning to. Legends, I've learned, are what happen when competence meets crisis. After her mother died, she took over the healer's hut, half apothecary, half sanctuary. Herbs hung from the rafters, their scents layering like soft arguments. Sage against lavender, pine against smoke. She began experimenting with the ashes of the blue fire night, mixing them into poultices that seemed to draw out infection faster, soothe fevers longer. The ashkeepers called her reckless, the sick called her divine. I saw her less often then. She had apprentices of her own and the weight of expectation on her shoulders. Still, every festival of renewal, she'd find me in the crowd. We'd stand near the central flame as it was divided into 100 sparks, and she'd murmur something half to herself, half to me. We keep passing the same fire, but it doesn't make us the same. I didn't understand what she meant until much later. The turning point came on a night that should have been ordinary. The moon was low, the frost thick enough to make the air taste metallic. I was at the river, hauling water, when I saw a glow rising from the village, too bright, too wild. Fire was common, but this was no hearth. The sky itself seemed to ripple with orange veins. I ran until the air sliced my lungs raw. By the time I reached Myra's hut, it was already an inferno. People shouted her name, forming a useless circle around the blaze. The ashkeepers barked orders, their polished badges gleaming in the firelight, but no one dared approach. The flames weren't natural. They moved as though guided by something angry and precise. Sparks arced upward, then folded back, devouring their own smoke. I remember the heat on my face, the smell of resin and panic. Mira burst through the doorway carrying a small bundle, her daughter, Liana. The child's cry cut through the roar like a command. Behind her, shelves collapsed, scattering jars that exploded in brief green flares. Someone reached for Myra's hand, but she shook her head. "Take her," she said, pressing the baby into my arms. I still feel the weight of that trust, heavier than the child herself. She turned back into the fire before anyone could stop her. Some say she was trying to save her herbs, others her notes. I think she was trying to save her proof. The evidence that faith could be measured, that warmth could heal beyond metaphor. The roof gave way moments later. The sound was less a crash than a sigh, the exhalation of something giving up. When the embers cooled, all that remained was ash fine enough to stain tears gray. The council declared it an accident. They said a spark had escaped the hearth, that even Myra's skill couldn't defy chaos. But the whispers spread quickly, that the ashkeepers had feared her experiments, that they'd tampered with her stores to humble her. No one dared accuse them openly, the breath law forbade public conflict. Yet the village's faith fractured along quiet lines, between those who believed the goddess had reclaimed her servant and those who suspected human jealousy had done the work. Liana was taken in by a merchant family bound for the south. They claimed it was mercy, that the child should not grow up among the ruins of her mother's name. I watched the caravan depart from the ridge above the valley. Snow fell gently, as if trying to disguise the tracks. The child did not cry. She stared straight ahead, eyes the color of winter water. I remember thinking that she looked too calm for someone who had already lost everything. After that, Valmir changed. The ashkeepers grew stricter. They outlawed individual experimentation, forbidding anyone to alter or study the sacred ash. The breath law, once fluid as smoke, hardened into scripture. Each family was now required to recite its verses before dawn. Fires were inspected, records kept. Warmth had become bureaucracy, and faith had turned administrative. Some called it stability, I called it mourning. I left soon after. The valley that had once felt eternal now seemed claustrophobic, its rules too tight for breathing. I wandered south along the trade routes Mira had once spoken of, carrying a single ember sealed in a glass jar, a farewell more than a relic. The journey took months. I crossed forests that smelled of wet stone and cities where people no longer prayed to heat but to light, electric, unfeeling, endless. In one of those cities, Sethem, they spoke a different language but worshipped the same paradox. The sun itself was their deity, and the queen its chosen voice. Her palaces glittered with gold, her servants walked barefoot on marble that still held the noon within it. I didn't meet her, of course. People like me belonged to the edges, where shade was currency. But I heard whispers of a young maid with northern eyes, storm gray and solemn, who could calm tempests with her touch. When I finally saw her, years later, during the festival procession, I knew instantly who she was. Liana, grown but unmistakable. She carried a bowl of glowing coals before the queen, steady as a statue. The crowd cheered, mistaking reverence for obedience. I watched her inhale, slow and deliberate, the way her mother once had, and the fire brightened. That moment, just a breath, just a flicker, bridged two worlds. The frozen huts of Valmir and the sun-struck palaces of Sethem. It was proof that warmth, once shared, never truly dies. It migrates, waiting to be recognized. Back in Valmir, they still tell Myra's story as tragedy. I prefer to think of it as translation. She didn't perish, she was rewritten. Her flame carried south inside the heart of a child who would one day teach queens that fire does not ask who it warms. Even now, when I tend my small hearth at night, I catch echoes of her voice in the crackle. It reminds me that every system, however sacred, owes its existence to someone who loved beyond its rules. Mira did not merely keep the breath, she taught it to travel. And though her hut burned to ash, her warmth kept walking. The desert greeted her the way the frost once greeted us, with indifference first, and then a test. Liana grew up under skies so wide they seemed to erase the notion of walls. The traders who carried her south had intended to sell her into service, but the girl's silence unsettled them. Even at 8 years old, she had the bearing of someone who listened to fire. When they reached Sethem, the city of sun and marble, the traders found themselves hesitating. Something in her gray eyes made the deal feel like sacrilege. They left her instead at the temple infirmary, claiming it was charity. Perhaps it was. Sedhem was a universe away from Valmir. I remember my first glimpse of it. How the air shimmered as though the city itself were exhaling light. The streets were paved with limestone that trapped the day's heat and released it at night like stored breath. Markets spilled color everywhere. Saffron, copper, lapis. Incense rose in lazy spirals, thick with honey and smoke. In place of our frostbitten humility, Sedhem wore confidence like perfume. They worshipped the sun not as comfort but as conquest. Every prayer began with a gesture toward the sky, as if demanding acknowledgement. For a northern girl, the heat was a kind of violence. Liana fainted often at first. Her lungs, trained to the crisp thin air of Valmir, rebelled against the heavy sweetness of Sedhem. But adaptation is a northern virtue. She learned to move slower, to drink water salted with ash, a trick remembered from her mother's stories. Within a year, she was stronger than most native-born servants. The palace took notice. It was the queen herself, Seraphine of Sedhem, who first saw the child's talent. During the festival of renewal, a lamp caught fire in the royal library. By the time servants arrived, Liana had smothered the flames using only her shawl and a handful of sand. When the queen questioned her, Liana simply said, "I listened to its breath." Those words traveled through the palace faster than smoke. Seraphine was unlike any monarch I had known. Barefoot in her own halls, she believed the ground should remember her. She walked without jewels, though her skin shimmered with gold dust. Her rule was one of intellect, not intimidation. She kept scholars instead of soldiers and treated knowledge as tribute. When she summoned Liana to serve in the royal archives, the court whispered that the queen was collecting curiosities again, a barbarian child from the Frostlands to amuse her. But Seraphine saw something more. In the library, Liana discovered a world that felt oddly familiar. Shelves lined like rows of sleeping hearths, scrolls coiled in silence, dust motes glimmering like sparks. She learned quickly, mastering languages meant to keep servants ignorant. Soon she was reading not just inventories but histories, forgotten treatises on the servant queens of Maris, a dynasty from before Sedhem's founding. These women had ruled not through decree but through equilibrium, balancing the heat of the sun with the cool of subterranean springs. They called it the breath of Maris. What struck Liana most were the similarities to Valmir's breath law. The same idea appeared again and again. Life sustained by exchange, power maintained through shared warmth. The Maris queens believed the world survived not by domination but by rhythm. They built temples half buried in sand, designed so that morning light could only enter after passing through a pool of water, its fire tempered before touching the sacred text. Their motto, carved above every entrance, read, "To burn wisely is to serve." Liana began copying the fragments, combining them with what she remembered from home. She wrote in two tongues, the southern script of Sedhem and the northern runes of Valmir, so the ideas could never again be separated. When the queen discovered her translations, she ordered them bound in gold leaf covers. "Every flame," Seraphine said, "needs a keeper. Perhaps you are mine." It was not flattery, it was prophecy disguised as affection. Under the queen's patronage, Liana rose from servant to scholar, from scholar to advisor. She introduced new practices, small altars of both fire and water, rituals of breath before judgment, the teaching of controlled exhalation to calm tempers during councils. At first, the priests scoffed. Then they noticed disputes ending more peacefully, crops thriving where the old irrigation failed. Soon the rituals of a Frostland orphan became state doctrine. I visited Sedhem during those years, drawn by rumor and homesickness. The city had changed since my first arrival. Where once the air shimmered only with heat, now there was balance. Fountains cooled the courtyards. Citizens carried shaded lamps at midday as symbols of restraint. The queen called it the era of shared light. I saw Liana once across a courtyard, tall, composed, dressed in linen the color of ashes. She did not see me, but I recognized her posture. Myra's quiet defiance reborn. Prosperity followed her influence. The empire's trade expanded, scholars flourished, and the desert seemed to soften. Yet success, like warmth, breeds jealousy. The priests who had once mocked Liana now resented her. To them, she blurred boundaries too freely. Servant and queen, faith and reason, fire and water. They whispered that her teachings diluted divine authority, that she practiced northern witchcraft disguised as wisdom. Liana ignored them. She had inherited her mother's calm, the kind that unsettles those who thrive on noise. She continued her work, restoring old texts, founding schools where breath control and meditation were taught beside arithmetic. For the first time in Sethem's history, servants were allowed to read. It was revolutionary and dangerous. Knowledge, like flame, spreads fastest where air is scarce. One evening, during a sandstorm that turned the city gold gray, I found myself sheltering near the palace gates. Through the wind, I heard music, a low, rhythmic humming, dozens of voices breathing in unison. Later I learned it was Liana's doing. She had gathered servants in the inner court to teach them the northern chant. In through the nose, out through the heart. The song carried through the corridors, echoing against marble, blending with thunder. Even the queen joined. The storm broke early that night, as if pacified. When dawn came, the air felt changed, lighter, almost grateful. Sethem's people began adopting the chant in daily life. Fishermen whispered it while casting nets. Potters used it to steady their hands. A new culture was forming, one that treated balance as sacred and breath as prayer. Historians later called this the confluence era. To the people living it, it simply felt natural, inevitable, as though two distant fires had finally found each other and decided to share heat instead of competing. Liana's northern heritage became mythologized. Children played games pretending to be the frost-born servant who taught the sun to breathe. But I remember the human beneath the legend. I once managed to speak with her briefly after a council meeting. Her voice was quieter than I expected, worn at the edges. "They think we brought balance," she said. "But balance is never peace. It's work, constant work." She smiled then, small and tired. I think my mother knew that. The queen adored her, perhaps too openly. They spent long evenings debating philosophy, sometimes falling into companionable silence. The courtiers began calling Liana the shadow of the sun, both in admiration and in warning. For every empire that finds balance, there are always those waiting to tip the scales. Still, those years were golden. Sethem blossomed under dual light, sun above, fire within. The breath of Maris returned to architecture, politics, medicine. And at the heart of it all stood a woman from the frozen north, carrying her mother's secret between worlds. When I left the city again, I carried with me a small clay jar she had given the queen, half filled with sand, half with ash. "For remembrance," she'd said. "For breath." I didn't know then that remembrance would soon be all that was left. I had been gone from Sethem 3 years when the first rumors reached me. They came by caravan, traveling faster than the wind but slower than truth. The words changed with each retelling. The queen is bewitched. The servant has taken her mind. The breath of Maris has turned to poison. I tried not to believe them. Empires, I told myself, always fear what they cannot control. But the letters that followed, smuggled, fragmented, trembling with urgency, carried details only an eyewitness could know. Something sacred had begun to rot. It started, as most collapses do, not with hatred but with envy. The priests of the solar temple had tolerated Liana's reforms only as long as they could claim credit for them. But when the queen issued her decree naming Liana keeper of breath and balance, their tolerance burned away like dew. The title placed her above the priesthood, equal even to the crown in matters of faith. For the first time in Sethem's history, a woman born without lineage was written into the book of governance. Her signature appeared beside the queen's on laws regulating trade, irrigation, and education. To many, it was triumph. To others, heresy. The priests began whispering about northern sorcery. They claimed Liana's breath rituals altered the mind, that her teachings turned servants into disciples. They pointed to the way palace workers now greeted each other not with a bow but with the hand-over-heart gesture she had taught. Proof, they said, that devotion had been redirected from son to mortal. When the queen fell ill that summer, the whispers erupted into accusation. Fever consumed her, the kind that steals coherence by degrees. Liana refused to leave her bedside, applying cool cloths, murmuring the breath chant as medicine. The court interpreted devotion as manipulation. She binds the queen with northern spells, they cried. She feeds her foreign ash instead of prayer. I returned then, traveling day and night through dunes that seemed to hiss with disapproval. By the time I reached Sethem, the city had split into factions. The streets smelled of incense and suspicion. Posters appeared on walls depicting a faceless woman surrounded by blue fire, a warning and a prophecy. The queen recovered briefly, long enough to summon a public assembly. She appeared thin, eyes fever bright, but her voice still carried that unmistakable steadiness. "There is no witchcraft here," she declared. "Only fear." Yet even as she spoke, the priests knelt ostentatiously, murmuring prayers that sounded like counterspells. Their defiance was theater, but the audience was ready to believe. Liana stood behind her, silent. The sun caught the gray in her hair, and for the first time I saw exhaustion where once there had been serenity. When the queen finished, Liana stepped forward. "Fire does not ask who it warms," she said softly. The crowd murmured, some in awe, some in outrage. To the faithful, it was a challenge, to the frightened, a confession. That night, the queen's chambers were sealed. The guards claimed she needed rest. Others whispered she was dead already. The priests seized the moment. They summoned a council, accusing Liana of resurrecting the forbidden cult of Maris, the ancient servant queens who had dared to rule through balance instead of dominance. "She teaches heresy," they thundered. She would unmake the sun itself, drown it in shadow and ash. The trial was swift, though no law permitted it. Liana was brought to the great hall in chains of polished bronze, more ornament than restraint. I was among the spectators, one face in a sea of hundreds. The air smelled of myrrh and fear. She did not defend herself. When asked if she had conspired to usurp divine authority, she answered only, "Authority is not divine. Breath is." The high priest, a man whose voice carried like a hammer, declared her words blasphemy. "You admit," he said, "to teaching servants that they are equal to their masters, that breath and light belong to all." Liana met his gaze. "Do you breathe differently from them?" The hall fell silent, not because they lacked an answer, but because the answer was too obvious. Her composure enraged them more than guilt ever could. They stripped the queen's decree from the walls, tore her title from the records, and sentenced her to exile, a polite word for disappearance. At dawn, soldiers led her toward the desert's edge. She carried nothing but a clay jar, half sand, half ash. I tried to follow but was turned away. The gates closed with a sound that felt final. 2 days later, the queen's chambers were found empty. The guards swore they had heard her voice in the night, singing softly, a melody woven from breath. On her pillow lay a strand of gray hair and a note. "Balance cannot be burned." The empire reacted as empires do, with denial and revision. The priests declared both women dead, victims of divine correction. Temples were rededicated, murals repainted, history rewritten. The chant was outlawed. Anyone caught performing it faced lashes or imprisonment. Scrolls bearing the breath of Maris were gathered and burned in the courtyards. The ashes rose in spirals that looked disturbingly like smoke signals. But repression only perfects memory. Servants continued the ritual in secret, disguising it as work songs or lullabies. The phrase "in through the nose, out through the heart" survived in corners of the empire where priests rarely ventured: stables, kitchens, laundries. It became a code for quiet defiance. Even those who had never heard of Valmir or the Frostlands felt its rhythm in their breath. I remained in Sethem, though each day felt like walking through a mausoleum of light. The queen's marble statues still gleamed, but no one met their eyes. The markets were quieter, laughter rarer. At sunset, the air used to hum with gratitude. Now it pulsed with guilt. The sun itself seemed harsher, less generous. Years passed. The priests consolidated power, renaming themselves guardians of purity. They forbade mixed study of science and faith, declaring that understanding heat and worshipping it could never coexist. The library where Liana had worked was sealed, its windows bricked, its books relocated to vaults accessible only to the ordained. They built a new temple on its ruins, a monument to caution disguised as devotion. And yet, on certain nights when the wind from the north slipped through the streets, people claimed to hear a whisper beneath it. A woman's voice, calm and steady, reminding the city how to breathe. Children said they saw a figure at the edge of the desert, walking barefoot through sand that never cooled. Wherever she stepped, the ground shimmered faintly, as if remembering frost. I like to think the priests were right about one thing, that she practiced resurrection. Not the dramatic kind that conquers death, but the quieter version that makes forgetting impossible. I left Sedhem for the last time carrying a single fragment from her banned writings. It was a line she had inscribed on the margin of a scroll, half in the northern tongue, half in southern script. Every system burns by its own logic. Only mercy rewrites the law. When I reach into memory now, I see her standing before the council, bronze shackles glowing in torchlight, face serene as dawn. They thought they were extinguishing her. Instead, they were giving her to history. Because that's how fire works, it consumes, but it also reveals what cannot be unmade. Centuries passed, and the world forgot the names but not the patterns. Empires rose, empires fell, and each built its monuments to mastery, the illusion that warmth, power, or progress could be owned. The ashes of Sedhem became trade routes. The ruins of Valmir vanished beneath new forests. Yet sometimes when archaeologists dig deep enough, history exhales. It happened in 2023. A team working in northern Egypt uncovered what they believed to be a minor site of the late Bronze Age. Sand gave way to limestone, limestone to antechamber, and in that chamber they found fragments of scrolls, thin as onion skin, written in 2 languages. The first was familiar, an early form of the southern dialect once spoken in Sedhem. The second puzzled them. It resembled northern runes recorded only in myths. On one fragment, half buried in dust, appeared a line. In through the nose, out through the heart. At first they dismissed it as coincidence, a ritual note, perhaps. But when they compared the handwriting to texts preserved in the royal archives of Sedhem, they found an eerie match. The same curves, the same small flourish at the end of an L and faintly beneath the brittle ink, pressed into the fibers by an older stylus, another inscription. Liana of Valmir. The press called it the breath tablets. Scientists tried to analyze the ash residue used as ink, but the compound resisted classification. It glowed faintly under infrared light, a spectral blue, like frost seen through fire. Samples stored at room temperature retained warmth long after removal from the chamber. Thermal cameras recorded fluctuations, as if the scrolls themselves were breathing. Documentarians swarmed the site, calling it proof of a lost climate cult. Theories multiplied. That the breath law was an early thermodynamic philosophy, that Sedhem had achieved renewable energy centuries before the Industrial Age, that the legend of Elandra masked proto-scientific knowledge of combustion and oxygen exchange. Experts argued on television about whether the blue dust, described in northern myths, could have been a phosphorus compound, or perhaps a primitive battery. But what struck me most were the photos. I remember seeing one in a magazine while waiting in a hospital lobby. The fragment rested on black velvet, edges burned but intact. You could still read the words that had survived the fire of centuries. Fire does not ask who it warms. Beneath it, the curator had written, attributed to Liana of Valmir, ca. 980 BCE. Something about that sentence unsettled me. the way it reduced a life to attribution. She had become a data point, a relic of curiosity, her defiance translated into academic caution. Yet as I looked at the photograph, I felt the room change temperature. The air from the vent brushed my skin with a familiar rhythm, in through the nose, out through the heart. Maybe coincidence, maybe memory. What fascinates me is how the pattern persists. Every generation rediscovers the same physics of need and generosity. We invent new vocabularies for the same hunger: electricity, connectivity, economy. We build grids that mimic hearths, networks that mirror the old exchange of warmth. We call them systems, but they obey the same logic as Valmyr's fires, alive only when shared. Consider our cities today. Lights burn through the night so no one must face darkness alone. Servers hum like distant hearths, carrying messages across oceans. Heat, now digital, flows between strangers who will never meet. And yet the fragility remains. When power fails, we still huddle together instinctively, our devices useless, our breath the oldest generator. I've read articles comparing the breath law to modern ecology, to the idea that balance, not growth, is the true measure of survival. Others see it as metaphor for justice, the redistribution of warmth, the refusal to let comfort pool in a few hands while others freeze. Every interpretation reveals more about us than about them. Perhaps that's the point. Myths survive not because they are true, but because they remain accurate. Sometimes I imagine what Liana would think of us. Our skyscrapers exhale heat into the sky, our oceans, once cool, now simmer. We have mastered fire so completely that we've forgotten it was ever alone. The frost she fled is returning, not as weather but as warning. Scientists call it climate change. The old stories would have called it imbalance. The language differs, but the message is the same. We mistook ownership for stewardship. In universities, students study the Maris hypothesis, the theory that Liana's teachings anticipated homeostasis, the self-regulating systems of nature. Professors quote her phrases in lectures about sustainability. Few notice the irony that an idea born in a hut of desperation is now discussed under fluorescent lights powered by coal. When I walk through modern cities, I still see echoes of her. The motion-activated lights that flare as you pass, mimicking a hearth acknowledging presence. The breathing exercises incorporate mindfulness programs, stripped of history but retaining the same cadence. Even the way we describe digital connection, going viral, spreading warmth, keeping the fire alive, reveals how old instincts survive beneath new code. Once, at a museum exhibit on ancient technologies, I found myself standing before a reconstruction of a Valmerian hearth. The label read, "Replica, origin uncertain, circa 1000 BCE. Possibly ceremonial." I laughed quietly. Everything sacred becomes ceremonial once its necessity is forgotten. I leaned closer, watching the simulated flames flicker behind glass, and whispered her words. The motion sensor detected my breath and the fire brightened. For a moment, I felt absurdly moved. The guard glanced over, and I stepped back, pretending interest in the next display. That night, the image wouldn't leave me. The artificial fire responding to a human breath, technology bowing briefly to biology. It felt like an apology across millennia. We live surrounded by machines that promise constant warmth, radiators, data streams, social networks, and yet loneliness persists like unspent winter. Perhaps what the breath law understood, and what we've forgotten, is that warmth was never meant to be convenient. It was meant to be participatory. Shared heat demanded presence. Shared presence demanded care. When I teach history now, I end my lectures with her phrase, written on the board in both tongues. Fire does not ask who it warms. Students always fall silent. Some interpret it as compassion, others as caution. I tell them it is both, that every civilization runs on borrowed breath, and every generation must decide whether to hoard it or pass it on. The fragments found in Egypt rest today in a temperature-controlled vault, monitored by sensors that measure humidity, oxygen, and warmth, machines replicating the very balance those scrolls once taught. Sometimes I imagine them pulsing faintly in the dark, alive in their own small way, waiting for someone to remember how to listen. And when the world outside grows colder, metaphorically or otherwise, I remind myself of the simplest inheritance left by those long-gone hands. The faith that even now, somewhere, someone is keeping the fire. So here we are, you and I, at the edge of the firelight again. The story has walked full circle, from frost to flame, from servant to queen, from myth to the low hum of your own electricity. The room you sit in now might look nothing like Valmir or Setham, but the rhythm is the same, light flickering against darkness, human breath steadying its dance. It's strange, isn't it? Thousands of years have passed, and yet our most advanced technology still imitates a hearth. When I close my eyes, I can almost see them. Mira tending her oven in the snow, the Queen of Setham tracing sunlight across marble, and Liana standing between them, one palm open to the frost, the other to the desert heat. In her stillness, the world found a pulse it had forgotten. The myth says she vanished into the dunes, but I don't believe that anymore. I think she diffused, became pattern, became principle, became the idea that keeps reappearing whenever we rediscover how to care for something beyond ourselves. The archaeologists still argue about her. Some claim she never existed, that Liana of Valmir was simply a composite figure, a narrative humans invented to explain the mysterious convergence of science and faith. Others insist her bones lie beneath that Egyptian dig site, preserved by the same mineral dust she once used to rekindle fires. I've read both sides, smiled at their confidence, and thought, perhaps they're both right. Maybe she existed exactly as long as she was needed. Because that's what warmth does, it doesn't demand permanence, it asks for participation. It exists only in motion, in transfer, in the act of giving. Once you stop tending it, it ceases to be. That's the quiet truth hidden in every story we've told tonight. When I speak of Valmir's ashes, I'm not really talking about the past. I'm talking about how we survive change, how we build systems to make generosity durable. The Ash Keepers did it with ritual. Setham tried with law. We do it now with grids, institutions, and fragile democracies. None are perfect. All are necessary. The line between queen and servant, ruler and ruled, scientist and believer, it was never moral, only logistical. Everyone needs warmth. Everyone must choose how to share it. So before we let the night close, pause. Look around your room. The light from your screen paints your hands in soft gold. It is the new fire, the new altar. Somewhere, power stations hum, wind turbines turn, cables pulse through soil and sea, all to keep this glow alive. You are breathing with billions of strangers right now, connected by invisible exchanges of heat and signal. This is what Liana understood, that civilization is nothing more than a long conversation about warmth. The historians like to say her last words were, "Fire does not ask who it warms." I've repeated them so many times they feel almost personal. But sometimes I imagine her saying one more line after that. Something unrecorded, too simple to survive the scholar's edits. Maybe she whispered, then learned to warm wisely. That's the invitation she left us. To burn, but with discernment. To build systems that give back as much as they take. To remember that the distance between frost and fire isn't geography, it's empathy. Outside, the world is still both cold and burning. We are heating the air, cooling our hearts, repeating cycles we claim to have transcended. But every system, no matter how vast, begins in a small gesture, a spark passed from one hand to another. Maybe you'll think of that the next time you light a candle, charge a phone, or touch another person's shoulder in reassurance. Those moments are the modern rituals of the breath law. As I speak, the last of the digital glow trembles across the room. The story is cooling now, ready to rest in ash until someone else stirs it. That's the part we often forget. Stories are embers too. They don't end, they wait. Every retelling is a rekindling, every listener another guardian of the same fragile heat. So tonight, as your screen dims and the hum of the city fades, remember them, Mira with her patient hands, the queen who walked barefoot through light, the servant who taught an empire how to breed. Remember that all their wisdom condensed into a single, enduring practice, to keep warmth moving. The wind outside may scratch at your walls. The dark might gather, curious. Let it. You know what to do. In through the nose, out through the heart. Fire does not ask who it warms. Keep the lights low. Keep the breath steady. Keep the ember alive. We'll continue soon. Perhaps not in this story. Perhaps in another time entirely, but the lesson will be the same. Not villains. Systems. Not miracles. Exchanges. Not endings. Only the long, glowing work of keeping each other alive.